We're often told the Battle of the Bulge was won by grit and Patton's toughness. But what if the real hero wasn't a man, but a secret piece of metal that let pilots see in the dark? In 1944, German High Command laughed at Allied attempts to map terrain from the air. They stopped laughing when Patton's tanks appeared exactly where their map said was impassable. You remember the stories of the Battle of the Bulge, but the most important secret of that battle wasn't fought on the ground. It was waged in the air by a device that could map the Earth through solid clouds. We're often told the Battle of the Bulge was won by grit and Patton's toughness. But what if the real hero wasn't a man, but a secret piece of metal that let pilots see in the dark? This is the story of a secret that lived inside a box, a device so powerful the Axis command thought it was impossible, and how it gave General George Patton the one thing he needed more than bullets or gasoline: a map. We're going to pull that thread apart. If you find these hidden stories of ingenuity as fascinating as I do, a simple click on that subscribe button ensures you won't miss the next one. It's a small click that helps us continue to bring these forgotten histories to light. To understand the miracle, we first have to understand the nightmare. December 1944, the Ardennes Forest. It was a place that the Allied High Command, in their optimism, had started to call a ghost front, a quiet sector. It was a place to rest green troops, to break them in gently. The veterans knew better. They knew no front was truly quiet. But even they could not have imagined what was brewing on the other side of that dense, dark forest. The trees themselves were a fortress, ancient, tall, packed so tightly together that daylight struggled to reach the forest floor, and beneath them a tangle of ravines, sharp hills, and narrow, muddy tracks. The main roads were few, and they were easily defended. This was, by any military definition, an impassable terrain for a modern armored army. At least, that's what the Allies believed. But the Germans knew better. This was the same ground they had used in 1940 to bypass the Maginot Line and shatter the French army. And now, Hitler, in a desperate final gamble, was staking everything on a repeat performance. He had gathered his last great armored reserve, the 6th Panzer Army, and aimed it like a spear at this quiet sector. He believed he could break the Allied line, split the British from the Americans, and force a negotiated peace. And he had an ally more powerful than any panzer division: the weather. That winter was one of the worst in recorded European history. A thick, wet, freezing fog blanketed the entire front. Sleet, snow, and freezing rain turned every road into a river of mud and ice. For the Allies, this was a disaster. Our entire doctrine of war by late 1944 depended on air power. We had achieved total supremacy in the skies. Our fighter bombers, the Thunderbolts and Lightnings, were the terror of the Wehrmacht. They were in effect Patton's long-range artillery. But they couldn't fly. They were grounded. The pilots sat in their tents, listening to the rain, feeling useless. This meant the frontline troops were blind. And more than that, the commanders were blind. You cannot direct a battle if you do not know where the enemy is. You cannot move reserves if you do not know where the roads are clear. All intelligence had been reduced to the reports of frozen, terrified men in foxholes, hearing the rumble of engines in the fog, but seeing nothing. This was the situation when, on December 16th, the entire forest erupted. Over 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks smashed into the thin American line. The surprise was total. The scale was unimaginable. The Axis plan was working perfectly. Their commanders were confident, even arrogant. They had studied the Allies. They knew we were addicted to our aircraft. They knew our mapping, which relied on high-altitude photo recon planes, was now completely useless. The clouds were their shield. German intelligence reports from the period actively ridiculed Allied efforts at terrain mapping in bad weather. They considered it a frivolous waste of resources. They believed that if their planes couldn't see the ground, our planes couldn't either. This assumption was one of the most critical mistakes of the entire war, because while the P-51s and B-17s were grounded, a different kind of aircraft was flying. A handful of specially modified planes flying high above the storm were painting the picture of the battlefield with a brush that didn't use light. They were using radar. But this wasn't the kind of radar you're thinking of. It wasn't the long-range sweeping beam that looked for bombers over London. This was something new, something small, powerful, and precise. It was a technology born of desperation, gifted in secret and perfected in laboratories hidden from the world. It was called the Cavity Magnetron, and this tiny device, no bigger than a man's fist, held the key to, in essence, a whistle. A high-frequency, high-power whistle for radio waves. Before the magnetron, radar sets were enormous, cumbersome things. They used low-frequency waves that gave a blurry, imprecise picture. They could tell you something was out there, but they couldn't tell you what. They were fine for spotting a fleet of ships or a squadron of bombers, but they were useless for telling the difference between a forest and a field. The British knew they needed something better. In the desperate days of 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging and the threat of invasion looming, their scientists were in a race against time. Two men, John Randall and Harry Boot, at the University of Birmingham, were working on the problem. And what they created was a marvel. By fashioning a block of copper with precisely drilled holes, or cavities, they created a resonant chamber that could generate microwave frequency radio waves at an incredible power level. It was a quantum leap. It meant a radar set could now be small enough to fit in the nose of a night fighter, and its beam would be sharp enough to paint a detailed picture of its target. But Britain was on the ropes. They had the invention, but they lacked the industrial power to mass produce it. So in September 1940, in one of the most selfless and pivotal acts of the war, a delegation of British scientists, led by Sir Henry Tizard, flew to America in total secrecy. They carried with them a locked black box. Inside that box, along with other British secrets, was the No. 12 Cavity Magnetron. When they revealed it to their American counterparts at the MIT Radiation Laboratory, the Americans were stunned. They had nothing like it. One American engineer famously said, "This is a pistol, and we're using rocks." The RAD Lab was born from this meeting, a massive top-secret project dedicated to weaponizing this new technology. Their first and most urgent task was to stop the U-boat menace in the Atlantic. The magnetron gave them the tool, ASV, or air-to-surface vessel radar. Suddenly, Allied patrol bombers could fly over the vast, dark Atlantic, and the radar beam, sharp as a needle, could pick out the tiny metal conning tower of a surfaced U-boat from miles away, even in total darkness or thick fog. The U-boat wolf packs, which had been strangling Britain, were systematically hunted and destroyed. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned. But the engineers at the RAD Lab were just getting started. If this radar could see a submarine on the water, what could it see on land? This question led to the next great development, H-2S radar, which the Americans would refine and call H-2X, or Mickey. This system was designed for bombers. A B-17 or a Lancaster, flying high above the cloud cover of industrial Germany, could now see the ground. The radar screen in the operator's dark station would paint a ghostly, glowing image. It was a crude picture, but it was a picture nonetheless. Water, like rivers or lakes, absorbed the radar waves and appeared black. Flat land, like fields, scattered some of it and appeared a dull gray. But dense, built-up areas, the brick and stone and steel of a city, reflected the waves brilliantly. They glowed on the screen like a beacon. For the strategic bombing campaign, this was a revolution. The Allies no longer had to wait for a clear day. The bombing could continue relentlessly, around the clock, in any weather. The Axis, with their conventional radar, were baffled. They couldn't understand how the bombers were finding their targets with such accuracy through 10/10 cloud. But even as H-2X was pounding German cities, some sharp-eyed operators began to notice other things. Subtleties in the glowing green image. The fuzz on the screen wasn't just random noise, it had texture. They began to realize they could see more than just cities and rivers. They could see terrain. They could see, for example, the difference between a flat, open field and a dense forest. The forest, with its millions of trees, its leaves and branches, scattered the radar signal in a unique way. It created a different texture on the screen than a snow-covered pasture. This was a fascinating curiosity, but for most of the war it was just that, a side effect. The main goal was bombing factories and rail yards. That is, until the Battle of the Bulge. When the German offensive smashed through the Ardennes, every branch of Allied intelligence was thrown into a panic. General Eisenhower and his staff at Schaeff were desperate. They needed a map. They needed to know where the German panzers were. Where were they going? And just as importantly, where could Patton's Third Army go to stop them? Photo reconnaissance was impossible. Ground patrols were being captured or killed. The entire Allied war effort was stalled, blind and freezing while the Germans advanced. And it was in this moment of total crisis that some brilliant unknown intelligence officer or radar technician made the connection. He remembered the fuzzy, textured images from the H-2X sets. He realized that the side effect of the bombing radar could be the primary tool of salvation. If that radar could tell a field from a forest, could it do more? Could it map the Ardennes? The call went out. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The fast, high-flying Mosquito bombers of the RAF and the new A-26 Invaders of the U.S. Army Air Forces were tasked. But they weren't carrying bombs. They were carrying the most advanced H-2X Mickeys in the inventory. These weren't the early models. These were refined, high-frequency versions. The beam was even sharper, the resolution even higher. These pilots flew grueling missions, not in the clear, but in the very teeth of the storm the Germans were relying on. They flew back and forth, high above the unseen battlefield, their radar operators staring intently at their screens, the green sweep of the beam painting its ghostly picture second by second. They weren't looking for individual tanks. They were looking for the roads. They were mapping the impassable forest. And the picture that emerged was a revelation. The radar cutting through the clouds confirmed what the old, outdated maps only guessed at. It showed the main roads, of course, but it also showed more. It showed the web of secondary roads, the logging tracks, the fire breaks, the small clearings in the woods. And it showed where the forests were truly dense and where they thinned out.
This was the intelligence jackpot. Back at Patton's headquarters, these new radar maps were overlaid with the old paper ones. And suddenly, the G2 intelligence officers could see the battle in a new light. They could see the choke points. They could see where the German spearheads, particularly Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Division, were getting stuck. The Germans, without this technology, were limited to the main roads. When those roads became blocked by destroyed vehicles or heroic American stands, the panzers were forced to try and navigate the side roads in the mud and snow. And they were bogging down. They were losing the one thing they couldn't afford to lose: time. The German High Command, still laughing at the idea of all-weather mapping, had no idea that their entire plan was being laid bare from 10,000 feet above the storm. They had pushed all their chips onto the table, betting on the fog of war. But the Magnetron had just lifted that fog. Now General Patton had his map. We all know the legend of Patton's Third Army, how, in an almost superhuman feat of logistics and command, he wheeled his entire army, which was facing east, a full 90 degrees north to strike the German flank. It's one of the most studied and admired maneuvers in military history. But we often focus on the grit, the sheer force of Patton's will. We picture him standing in the snow, directing traffic, demanding the impossible. That part is true, but it's not the whole story. An army of over 100,000 men doesn't just turn. It moves on roads. It consumes thousands of gallons of fuel per mile. It needs a plan, and that plan requires a map. The German plan depended on the Allies not having one. They believed Patton would be forced to move his divisions up the few main highways where they could be ambushed, blocked, and delayed. What they didn't count on was Patton knowing every secondary road, every trail, every fire break that the H-2X radar had painted. While the main German columns were stuck in epic traffic jams on the main routes, Patton's divisions, particularly the 4th Armored, didn't just stick to the highways. Guided by this new, precise radar intelligence, they used the entire road network. They bypassed the choke points. They used trails that the Germans themselves had deemed unusable for armor. They moved faster, more fluidly, and in more directions than the Germans thought was humanly possible. Imagine the shock of a German Panzer commander, hunkered down in a village he believes is safe, miles from the main road, only to hear the rumble of Sherman tanks coming at him from a logging trail his own maps marked as a dead end. This happened again and again. The American advance was relentless. The Mickey sets weren't just a navigation tool, they were an offensive weapon. They allowed Patton to find the seams in the German line and pour his armor through them. The Battle of the Bulge was a brutal, grinding fight. It was absolutely won by the incredible courage of the individual American soldier. The men who held Bastogne, the battered bastards, are legends for a reason. But their relief, the breaking of the siege, was made possible by a technological advantage the enemy didn't even know existed. The Axis ridiculed terrain mapping. They believed in the supremacy of their own ground-level knowledge of the forest. But in the end, that arrogance was their undoing. The Magnetron had given the Allies a god's-eye view, and it proved decisive. The device that had saved Britain from the U-boats now saved the American army from encirclement. It's an incredible story of Allied cooperation. We're curious, what other secret weapons from the war do you think deserve more credit? Let us know in the comments below. Your ideas often become our future episodes. This way, we can all learn more of these hidden histories together. The story of the Magnetron is a perfect lesson in how warfare evolves. It's a story of how one technology, developed for one purpose, can be adapted by brilliant minds under pressure to solve a completely different problem. The men at the MIT Rad Lab who were trying to find submarines in 1941 could never have dreamed that their invention would be guiding Patton's tanks through a Belgian forest in 1944. This adaptability, this ingenuity, is a hallmark of that generation. They didn't just use the tools they were given, they invented new ways to use them. While the German war machine was often hampered by rigid thinking, by Hitler's insistence on wonder weapons that were too complex and too late, the Allies were iterating, adapting, and sharing. The Tizard mission is perhaps the greatest example of this. The willingness of Britain to share its most precious military secret with an ally, knowing that their combined industrial and scientific might was the only path to victory. And what became of this technology? After the war, the secret of the Cavity Magnetron became public. And it didn't just change warfare, it changed everything. The same device that mapped the Ardennes found its way into commercial aviation, making air travel infinitely safer with weather radar. It became the heart of the air traffic control system that guides planes to this day. The descendants of those H-2X sets were used by the Strategic Air Command in the B-47s and B-52s that formed the backbone of the Cold War deterrent. They used terrain-following radar, a direct descendant of the Bulge mappers, to fly at treetop level, invisible to enemy defenses. That same radar technology was pointed upward, becoming the science of radio astronomy, allowing us to map the heavens, to see the structure of our own galaxy for the first time. It was used to map the surface of the Moon and Venus, peering through their clouds, just as it had peered through the clouds of the Ardennes. And in one of history's more peaceful ironies, an engineer at Raytheon named Percy Spencer, who was working on magnetron tubes, famously noticed that a chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. From that accident, the microwave oven was born. The same technology that guided armies and hunted submarines now heats our leftovers.
It's a powerful legacy for a device that started as a small block of copper in a desperate laboratory. When we look back at the Battle of the Bulge, it is right and proper to remember the men. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the defenders of St. Vith, the tankers of the 4th Armored. Their grit and sacrifice are the bedrock of that victory. But we must also remember the ghosts in the machine. The scientists, the engineers, the quiet, unseen radar operators in the back of a freezing airplane, staring at a green, glowing screen. They were fighting a different kind of war, a war of electrons and radio waves. They provided the light in the darkness. The German High Command's ridicule of terrain mapping was based on their own limitations. They couldn't conceive a way to do it, so they assumed it couldn't be done. It was a failure of imagination. And in modern warfare, a failure of imagination can be just as fatal as a failure of courage. Patton's army had the courage, but the Magnetron gave them the vision. It gave them the map. And with that map, they redrew the future of Europe. This story, the real story of how technology and tactics intertwine, is often more complex and fascinating than the headlines. The Battle of the Bulge is often simplified to a story of American toughness versus German desperation. And while it was that, it was also a story of competing technologies. It was a story of assumptions. The German assumption that the weather was their shield was proven false by a technology they didn't fully comprehend. They were, in effect, blinded by their own arrogance. They believed their intimate knowledge of the ground, the terrain, would give them the ultimate advantage in that forest. They were wrong. The Allies, with no ground knowledge, were able to create a better understanding from miles in the air, through a storm, thanks to a British invention and American manufacturing. This is a critical lesson. It's not always the side with the biggest tanks or the most men that wins. It's the side that can adapt, innovate, and, most importantly, see the battlefield most clearly. Patton's famous prayer for good weather is a key part of his legend. He wanted the skies to clear so his fighter bombers could fly. And eventually, on December 23rd, the weather did break, and the air power was unleashed, beginning the final doom of the German offensive. But what's so often forgotten is that for the most critical first week of that counteroffensive, in the drive to relieve Bastogne, the weather didn't matter. The Magnetron had made the weather irrelevant. The most important eyes Patton had weren't the pilots of P-51s. They were the Mickey operators in their dark, cramped stations, patiently watching a glowing line paint a map of a world no human eye could see. This is the kind of history that gets lost in the main narrative. If you believe these stories of the engineers and the inventors need to be told, the best way to support that is by sharing this video with a friend or family member who also appreciates this kind of history. It's the best way to help these stories find the audience they deserve. The legacy of the Magnetron is a reminder that the tools of war are often born from unexpected places. It's a story that connects the defense of London to the U-boats in the Atlantic, to the bombing of Germany, to the forests of the Ardennes, and finally, to the very kitchens we stand in today. It's a thread of ingenuity that runs through our entire modern world. The next time you see footage of the Battle of the Bulge, the snow, the forests, the tanks, remember the unseen battle. The battle of waves and particles fought in the skies above the storm. Remember the men who gave Patton his eyes. The story of the Magnetron doesn't end there, of course. To see what this technology did after the war, in the opening days of the Cold War and the race for space, click the video on your screen right now. As always, thank you for lending us your time. Let's continue to build upon that foundation. The arrogance of the German High Command wasn't born in a vacuum. It was a product of their own successes and their own technological paths. Their radar, the Freya and Würzburg systems, was excellent for its time. It was superb at detecting incoming bombers and directing flak and night fighters, but it was built on an older, long-wave technology. It required massive fixed installations or large, cumbersome mobile units. The idea of putting such a system in an airplane seemed, to them, absurd. Their own airborne radar, the Liechtenstein system, was a bulky, complex affair that was only suitable for the specialized role of a night fighter, and even then its range and resolution were poor. They were projecting their own technological limitations onto their enemy. They simply could not believe that the Americans and British had solved a problem that their own brilliant engineers had not. This cognitive gap was the Allies' greatest secret weapon. While German scientists were pursuing rockets and jet engines, weapons of terror and speed, Allied scientists, particularly at the MIT Rad Lab,
were focused on information, on seeing. They understood that the war would be won not just by the biggest explosion, but by the side that could process information faster and more accurately. The H-2X Mickey set was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Let's really put ourselves in the seat of that Mickey operator. He's a young man, probably in his early 20s. He's not a pilot or a gunner. He's a technician, highly trained, almost a scientist in uniform. He's in the fuselage of an A-26 Invader, a fast, light bomber. It's freezing cold. The plane is bucking and vibrating in the turbulence of the storm. He's in total darkness, save for the hypnotic green glow of his cathode ray tube. For hours, he does nothing but watch that glowing line sweep around and around, painting its picture. He's not just an operator, he's an interpreter. He has to translate these ghostly shapes, this fuzz, into actionable intelligence.
He knows the maps. He has the paper charts next to him. He's looking for the differences. The map says this is a field, but the radar shows the texture of a forest. Why? Because the map is 10 years old and the trees have grown. The map says this is an empty valley. The radar shows a bright, hard line. A road. A new road the Germans have built, or an old track they have reinforced. Or, even more critically, the radar shows a dozen bright, hard blobs where there should be nothing but trees. It's a vehicle park, a Panzer division, hiding, waiting for fuel. He marks it. Coordinates are passed to the radio operator. That intelligence flows back to headquarters, is combined with reports from other Mickey planes, and a new living map of the battlefield is created. A map that shows not just the static terrain, but the enemy's movements. This is what the Germans thought was impossible. They believed their forest cover was absolute. But the magnetron's microwaves didn't care about leaves. They didn't care about camouflage netting. They didn't care about the snow or the fog. They saw the hard, metallic reality underneath. Now, let's return to Patton. He was not a man known for his patience. He was a man of action, of relentless forward momentum. The idea of being blind, of being stalled by weather, was anathema to him. His famous prayer is often quoted, sometimes with a chuckle. But we have to understand the desperation behind it. He was sitting on the greatest armored force the world had ever seen, and it was useless to him. His relationship with the Army Air Forces, particularly with General Opie Wayland, was legendary. He called Wayland's fighter-bombers his rock-crushing artillery. He relied on them, and they were gone. So when his G2, his intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, came to him with these new, strange maps not from a camera, but from a radar, Patton, for all his cavalryman bluster, was smart enough to listen. He was a student of war, and he knew that new technology could change the game. He saw what Koch was showing him. He saw the routes, he saw the gaps, and he understood, perhaps better than any other commander, what this meant. It meant he could maneuver. The one thing the terrain and weather were designed to prevent, the magnetron had just given it back to him. So when he gave that famous 90-degree turn order, it wasn't a bluff. It wasn't just blind hope. It was a calculated move based on superior, secret intelligence. He knew where his 4th Armored Division could go. He knew where the 26th Infantry could move. He knew which roads could support the weight of his tanks and which were muddy traps. And he knew this because a 20-year-old in the back of an airplane had painted him a picture with radio waves. This completely reframes the narrative. The grit of the American GI was the fuel, Patton's will was the engine, but the magnetron was the steering wheel. It directed that power. We must also consider the cost of this ridicule for the Germans. Because they lacked this technology, they were forced to rely on their original plan, a plan that was rigid and depended on a strict timetable. When the 101st Airborne held Bastogne, a critical road junction, the entire German plan began to unravel. Piper's Panzers, the tip of the spear, were supposed to have seized bridges on the Meuse River in days. Instead, they were stuck on muddy roads, out of fuel, and being hunted. They were stuck because they were blind. Their own commanders had no way of rerouting them effectively. They had no Mickey sets to find the secondary roads. They were slaves to their old maps. The Allies, on the other hand, had become masters of the terrain. They were writing the map as they went. This advantage, this information supremacy, is the true hidden story of the Battle of the Bulge. It was the first true war of electronic mapping. And the ridicule from the Axis? It continued almost to the very end. German intelligence prisoners, when interrogated, simply refused to believe that the Allies could see through the clouds. They insisted it was a trick, or that the Allies were simply lucky, or that their own security had been compromised by spies on the ground. They could not, or would not, accept that they had been technologically defeated in a field they thought they understood. Their entire worldview was built on a set of assumptions that the magnetron had just rendered obsolete. This is a profound lesson in warfare. You must never assume your enemy is as blind as you are. You must never ridicule a capability just because you yourself cannot replicate it. The forest of the Ardennes, which the Germans saw as a shield, became their prison, and the magnetron was the key that locked the door. Let's expand on the human element of this. Think of the pilots of these Mickey birds. They were not fighter jocks. They were often crews from the strategic bombing campaign diverted to this new urgent task. They were flying in the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Not just the weather, which was atrocious enough to ice up wings and choke engines, but they were flying over a battlefield. Even in the clouds, German flak was a constant, terrifying threat. They were flying predictable, straight-line patterns to allow their radar to paint the ground. For an anti-aircraft gunner on the ground, even firing blind, a plane flying a straight line is a tempting target. These crews were taking immense risks, not to drop a bomb, but to gather a few square miles of fuzz on a screen. Many of them probably didn't even understand the full strategic importance of their missions. They were just told, "We need maps of this sector. Go fly it." They were the unsung, unseen heroes of Patton's relief force.
And what about the intelligence officers back at headquarters? Men like Colonel Koch. Their job was one of the hardest. They were inundated with panicked, contradictory reports from the front. They had to sift through this noise to find the signal. And now, they're being handed this new kind of intelligence, these radar films. They looked like abstract art. It takes a trained, patient, and imaginative mind to look at these splotches of green and gray and see a road, to see a path, to see an opportunity. They were the bridge between the high-tech wizardry of the Rad Lab and the muddy, bloody reality of the battlefield. They were the ones who had to convince a hard-charging old-school general like Patton that this newfangled electronic picture was something he could bet the lives of his men on. The trust that was required, the intellectual leap, is staggering. We often celebrate the courage of the soldier, but this was the courage of the mind, the courage to trust a new idea in the heat of the most desperate battle of the war. This story also turns the common narrative on Patton on its head. He's often portrayed as an instinctive, blood-and-guts commander. But the Bulge proves he was also a modern commander. He was willing to use any tool, any advantage that science could give him. He wasn't stuck in the past. He understood that this new information, however strange its source, was the key to unlocking the battlefield. He didn't ridicule it, he used it. And in this, he was the polar opposite of the German command that was ridiculing the very idea of all-weather mapping. This is the difference between victory and defeat. Not just in technology, but in the willingness to embrace it. The Germans had jet fighters, the Me-262, that were years ahead of anything the Allies had. But they were used incorrectly as bombers, on Hitler's whim. They had the V-2 rocket, a technological marvel. But it was a terror weapon, not a tactical one. It couldn't win a battle. The Allies had a tiny metal whistle in a box. It wasn't flashy. It didn't break the sound barrier, but it worked. It solved a real, immediate tactical problem. And that's why it was a true wonder weapon, far more than the rockets that were falling on London. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is therefore not just a story of defense and counterattack. It is the story of a technological ambush. The Germans ambushed the Americans on the ground, but the Allies, in return, ambushed the Germans from the stratosphere with a technology they couldn't see and didn't believe in. The forests of the Ardennes were the perfect stage for this drama, a place of shadows, fog, and confusion. The Germans thought they were the masters of that confusion, but the magnetron, the Mickey set, was a lamp. And in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. In this case, the one eye was the glowing green radar scope that gave Patton the vision to do the impossible. It's a powerful testament to the idea that ingenuity, shared among allies and applied with courage and imagination, is the most powerful force in any conflict. The Axis ridicule was the hollow sound of an old way of war being rendered obsolete by a future it refused to see. And that future was being painted, line by line, by a beam of microwaves cutting through the storm. Let's truly appreciate the scale of this. Patton's Fourth Army, specifically the 4th Armored Division, had to cover over 150 miles in some of the worst conditions imaginable. This wasn't a simple drive. This was a full-scale offensive maneuver in winter against an active and aggressive enemy. Every bridge was a potential choke point, every crossroads an ambush site. The German plan relied on this friction. They believed it would take Patton weeks to disengage from his current offensive and reposition to strike their southern flank. They calculated, based on their own doctrine and their own understanding of the terrain, that a relief of Bastogne was a logistical impossibility in the short term. They gave him weeks. He did it in days. This incredible speed is the central mystery of the counterattack. And the key to that mystery is this radar intelligence. It allowed for a level of operational planning that was simply not available to the enemy. While German units were getting lost, running out of fuel, and stumbling into American strongpoints, Patton's G2 and G3 operations staff were able to route divisions on parallel tracks. They could send one column down a main road, knowing it would draw the enemy's attention, while simultaneously sending 2 more columns down smaller secondary roads that the radar had identified. This is the classic blitzkrieg maneuver, the Schwerpunkt, the concentration of force at a weak point. But the irony is that the Allies were now using it against its inventors, and they were doing it because they had a better map. They were out-blitzing the blitz. The German commanders who had written the book on armored warfare were now being defeated by it. And they were being defeated because their foundational belief that the weather and terrain gave them cover was a lie. This technological gap was a product of 2 different philosophies. The German war effort by 1944 was increasingly divorced from reality. It was driven by ideology and by Hitler's whims. The Allied effort, particularly the American-British collaboration, was pragmatic. It was driven by engineers and scientists who were asked to solve specific, practical problems. How do we find U-boats in the dark? How do we bomb a factory through the clouds? How do we find a road in a forest? The Cavity Magnetron was the answer to all 3. It was a tool, not a monument. And useful tools, in the hands of resourceful people, win wars. The German ridicule was the sound of an opening mind. The buzz of the magnetron was the sound of an opening door. It's a story we should remember. When we celebrate the heroes of the greatest generation, we must celebrate not just the soldiers in the foxholes, but the scientists in the labs and the technicians in the bombers. They were all, in their own way, fighting for the same thing. They were all part of the same great, complex, and terrible machine. And in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it was the smallest, most secret part of that machine that made all the difference.
Let's dive even deeper into the context of this ridicule. It wasn't just a passing comment. The German Luftwaffe's reconnaissance doctrine was world-class in 1940. Their photo reconnaissance units, flying high-speed Heinkels and Junkers, had mapped Europe with meticulous precision. But their entire system was based on one thing: a clear view. Optical, cameras, film. When the weather turned bad, their doctrine simply stopped. They had no electronic alternative for ground mapping. Their focus, when it came to radar, was purely defensive and air-to-air. This was a critical failure in military imagination. They failed to ask, what if we could see without light? The Allies, on the other hand, were asking that question, driven by the desperate need to supply Britain. The Tizard mission was not just a sharing of technology, it was a sharing of a different way of thinking, a philosophy that said no problem is unsolvable. Not darkness, not fog, not clouds. This philosophy is what built the MIT Rad Lab into the single greatest concentration of scientific talent in the war. These weren't just military men. They were physicists, engineers, and academics pulled from the best universities in the country. They were given a nearly impossible task and a blank check. And they delivered. They didn't just copy the British magnetron. They perfected it. They figured out how to mass produce it. They developed new frequencies, new pulse rates, new antennas. They built the entire system around it. The H-2X Mickey was a marvel. It was a 200-pound system that had to be rugged enough to survive in a vibrating, freezing bomber, yet precise enough to detect a subtle change in ground texture from 20,000 feet. The engineering required was staggering, and it was all done in secret in just a couple of years. This rapid, focused innovation was something the fragmented, competing branches of the German military and industry simply couldn't match by 1944. So when the call came from Patton's headquarters, the system was ready. The technology had been matured. The operators had been trained for bombing, but the skill was transferable. The aircraft were available. The entire logistical and industrial chain was in place. This is what really wins a long war, not just a single brilliant invention, but the system to build it, deploy it, and adapt it. The Axis ridicule was, in effect, the ridicule of a cottage industry craftsman laughing at Henry Ford's assembly line. They just didn't get it. They didn't understand the scale of the Allied industrial scientific complex. They were still fighting a war of brilliant individual strokes of genius, while the Allies were fighting a war of systems, of logistics, and of information. Let's think about the battlefield from the German soldier's perspective. He's been told this is the great final offensive. He's been told the weather is his ally. He is advancing, pushing back the shocked Americans. He feels, for the first time in years, that victory is possible. He hides his tank or his truck under the thick pines, confident that no prying Allied fighter bomber can see him. He feels safe. Then, 2 days later, a column of American Sherman tanks, which should be miles away on the main highway, comes crashing through the trees on a tiny logging road he thought was secret. They're not just lost, they're coming straight for him. They know he's there. How? How can they know? It must be spies. It must be traitors. The paranoia and confusion this sowed in the German ranks was a powerful psychological weapon in itself. It shattered their confidence. Their greatest ally, the forest, had betrayed them. They didn't know, they could never know, that their betrayal came from a beam of radio waves, fired from a plane they never saw, processed by an operator they'd never meet, and delivered to a general they all feared. This is the true power of information warfare. It doesn't just destroy tanks, it destroys morale. It doesn't just find roads, it shatters plans. Patton's famous 90-degree turn wasn't just a physical maneuver, it was a psychological one. It was a statement to the German High Command, your sanctuary is gone, your shield is broken. I can see you. And that realization that they were naked and blind in the storm was the true beginning of their final defeat. The Battle of the Bulge was the last gasp of the Third Reich, and it was choked off by a piece of technology they had ridiculed as impossible. A fitting end to their arrogance. The magnetron,
A device born of British desperation and American ingenuity had proven that in the 20th century, the future belonged to those who could see in the dark. This entire episode serves as a powerful bookend to the European War. In 1940, German technological and tactical superiority, their blitzkrieg, seemed unstoppable. They had the better doctrine, the better coordination. By 1944, that situation had completely reversed. The Allies, through painful lessons, industrial might, and scientific collaboration, had become the masters of combined arms, high-technology warfare. The magnetron is the symbol of that shift. It represents the learning curve of the Allied war effort. They learned, they adapted, and they overcame. The German war machine, in contrast, had become rigid, brittle, and reliant on the outdated assumptions of its arrogant leader. Their ridicule of Allied mapping wasn't just a technical misjudgment. It was a symptom of a deeper, fatal disease, a refusal to adapt to a changing world, a world they had helped create, but one they no longer understood. And in the freezing cold of the Ardennes, that failure of understanding was paid for in the blood of their last army. The forests that were meant to be their path to victory became their grave, a grave that had been perfectly and precisely mapped by their enemies, from high above the clouds.
The story doesn't just end with the relief of Bastogne. The data gathered by these Mickey missions continued to pay dividends for the rest of the war. As the Allies pushed into Germany, these radar mapping techniques became standard practice. They were used to map river crossings, to identify hidden flak batteries, to find rail yards and factories that were shrouded in the industrial haze of the Ruhr Valley. The Mickey operators became some of the most valuable assets in the Army Air Forces. Their ghostly green images were, in many ways, more valuable than the sharpest photographs, because they were available now, not tomorrow if the weather clears. In warfare, speed of information is life. The magnetron was the heart of a system that pumped that information faster than the enemy could react. It's a testament to the men who flew those missions, but also to the system that supported them. The film canisters from those flights were rushed to development labs, where technicians, working with chemicals in the cold, produced the images. The photo interpreters, or in this case radar interpreters, then did their magic. These were not glorious jobs. This was painstaking, detailed work, often done under terrible pressure. A misplaced line on a map, a misidentified shadow, could mean the difference between a successful advance and a bloody ambush. We must remember these men and women, the Bothans and the backroom boys, as the British called them. They were as much a part of Patton's army as the tankers. When Patton's 4th Armored Division finally broke through to the 101st and Bastogne, it was a victory for them all. It was a victory for the paratrooper in his foxhole, and it was a victory for the scientist at MIT. This connection, this unbroken chain from the laboratory to the front line, is the real story of modern warfare. The Battle of the Bulge was, perhaps, the first war that was truly won by electronics. It set the stage for everything that was to come. The Cold War, with its chorus-analyzing satellites and surveillance, and even the modern day, where information, gathered by drones and sensors, is the most precious commodity on Earth. It all started here, in the snow, with a device the German High Command had laughed at. Their ridicule was the last laugh of an old, dying way of war. The future had arrived, and it was glowing on a green screen. When we reflect on this, it's a powerful reminder about the nature of assumptions. The German High Command assumed the terrain was impassable, they assumed the weather was their ally, they assumed the Allies were as blind as they were, and they assumed that their enemies' attempts at mapping were a joke. Every single one of these assumptions was wrong, and they were wrong because of a single secret piece of technology. It teaches us that you can have the best tanks, the best soldiers, and the best plan, but if your plan is based on a false understanding of reality, it will fail. The magnetron gave the Allies a clearer picture of reality. It allowed them to see the truth through the fog of war. And in the end, it was the truth that gave Patton his path and the Allies their victory. The next time you use a microwave, it's worth a moment's thought. You're holding a piece of that history,
a direct descendant of the device that mapped the Bulge and saved an army.